Greetings everybody. As people who follow my channel know that I have made a couple of other Star Wars videos, but for this one I wanted to focus mostly on the concept of balancing the ego in relation to the universe of Star Wars, so parts of this may be a bit of a review, but I have expanded on this aspect of the material, and I think this is one of the core elements of the series. It is what makes it somewhat unique in terms of major motion pictures, in my opinion. In my video titled Why Star Wars is Set in the Past, I covered briefly the split in the Force. In Episode 4, A New Hope, there are two suns setting on Tatooine, with Luke standing there symbolizing the duality that exists in the Star Wars universe. This is the split between the Apollonian and Dionysian. The Apollonian and Dionysian refer to the Greek sun gods Apollo and Dionysus, which are connected to the heart chakra on the Tree of Life. These are both masculine gods, but Apollo is the god of light, knowledge, and art, ruling over the realm of the masculine self-consciousness. This relates to the idea of individuality. Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and madness, rules over the realm of the feminine subconscious and relates to the idea of losing the self into a collective. Apollo represents humanity trying to overcome nature, while Dionysus represents the unknown elements of nature, striving to undermine humanity's illusion of control. Nietzsche identified these as two opposing forces in a constant struggle. Essentially, these are matters relating to the ego and emotion. Another way to understand it is the master and slave complex. Art is an attempt to try and resolve these two opposing forces and create a balance, therefore transforming them into complementary forces. To understand the split in the Star Wars universe, one must understand the structures of the Jedi and Sith orders. The Jedi are the Dionysian side of the Force, while the Sith are the Apollonian. I will start by examining the Jedi order because they are the group that came first. The Sith are the group that defected from the Jedi. Essentially, they became the antithesis of everything that the Jedi represent. The Jedi take a stance that is similar to the Manichaean philosophy of Asia in regards to the view of evil. They believe that it must be suppressed, or else the world will fall into darkness, which means that the ego, in turn, must be suppressed as well. The ego is the part that thinks, acts, discriminates, and decides. In the Jedi Order, this is replaced with the Jedi Code, the Council of 12, and the Force. The Jedi Code reads, "There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force." This Council of 12 are a secretive group where their structure and rules are largely unknown to the general public. They have a large library of information, but limit access to the public. The Jedi search for Force-sensitive babies and recruit them into their order. It is thought that if they are not recruited into the order, that they will possibly fall to the dark side. The children that they refer to as younglings, a reference to Carl Jung, are told to form no attachments, which is why the Jedi recruit children while they are young. The less attachment that they have to their parents and relatives, the better. The Jedi fear that attachments lead to fear, anger, and hatred of loss. These emotions are frowned upon by the Jedi because they can allure one over to the dark side, thus they are told to suppress these feelings deep down. For example, in Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Anakin is tested by the Council of 12. He is observed to have his thoughts dwelling on his mother. Anakin replies that he misses her.
Afraid to lose her, I think,
What has that got to do with anything?
Everything. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. I sense much fear in you.
The only family or education that the Jedi pupil has is the Order. They are told to be celibate for these reasons of forming attachments. The younglings train in groups, and as they grow older, a Jedi Master will train students individually by choosing a student to take on as his Padawan. The Padawan wears a braid to symbolize this status. When the Padawan finishes this training, he is knighted as a Jedi. The Jedi can then be granted a seat on the Council as well as the rank of Master once he has become an experienced and trusted member. Only Jedi Masters can take on a Padawan to train as a Jedi. The Jedi value the collective above all else by suppressing the ego. They want the Jedi to love everyone outside of the collective equally because everyone and everything is part of the Force. This is why families of Jedi children are largely ignored after the child is taken. Anakin Skywalker's mother was captured and killed by raiders, and the Jedi did nothing to help her. Anakin ended up going rogue and finding her in a raider camp only to have her die in his arms. When Anakin seeks advice from Yoda when he is having premonitions about Padme's death, Yoda has this advice.
Death is a natural part of life. Rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force. Mourn them do not. Miss them do not. Attachment leads to jealousy. The shadow of greed, that is.
What must I do, Master Yoda?
Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
What Yoda explains to Anakin is that in the Jedi Order, death has no meaning because everyone is just part of the Force. The attitude of selflessness and not forming attachments is collectivist, but paradoxically, it is isolating because if you love everyone equally, then you can love no one. This is why when a Jedi dies, they simply disappear. They are completely subordinate to the collective, and they don't have children, thus they die alone without having passed on their genes. For Anakin, this was unacceptable, and quickly fell to the dark side once he was convinced that the Sith would protect the ones he loved. Protection is a function of the ego, which is what the Sith revel in, but he could not control his ego, which resulted in the death of Padme, the very thing he was trying to prevent. When Anakin/Darth Vader died in Return of the Jedi, his body did not disappear because he had children. The person whose ego has not sufficiently grown, whose ego is weak, is incapable of mastering or coping with life. This is perhaps the reason why Anakin Skywalker fell to the dark side. His training in the Jedi Order was insufficient in preparing him for the fear of loss because he was told to have no connections. He was therefore left vulnerable because his ego was weak from years of suppression. A vacuum was created that would eventually draw him over to the Sith as a result. The person whose ego is overgrown and oversimplified cannot come to the real self. The Sith are an expression of the unrestrained ego. In order to keep their organization intact, they needed to adhere to the Rule of Two, which was established by a character named Darth Bane. The Rule of Two kept the Sith a small secretive organization that grew in power over time. One master taught one apprentice everything they knew until the apprentice became stronger and learned all they could from their master. The master is eventually overtaken and killed by the apprentice, thus taking their place. They would go on to complete the cycle by training their own apprentice, knowing that they too would eventually be succeeded by death.
Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? He became so powerful. The only thing he was afraid of was losing his power, which eventually, of course, he did. Unfortunately, he taught his apprentice everything he knew. Then his apprentice killed him in his sleep. It's ironic. He could save others from death, but not himself.
Only the strong survive in the world of the Sith. Each Sith was devoted to the dark side, and the Sith Order itself over their own personal gain. It is seemingly a paradox, but is a necessity in maintaining the structure of the Order. Individually, the Sith are self-absorbed, who would never risk their own lives or status for a cause greater than themselves. They had a lot of trouble working together. In groups, the students would combine their lesser powers to defeat their more powerful masters, thus weakening the Order. The rule of two was established to channel the egoic tendencies of the Sith to their favor. The apprentice will always desire the power of their master, and the master will always create power inherently. The apprentice emerges stronger and thus strengthens the order. Every Sith master places the order of the Sith over his own survival for this reason. Although the Sith are individually driven and selfish, they paradoxically must adhere to the rule of two in order to maintain themselves. The Sith code reads, "Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. Through victory my chains are broken. The Force shall free me." Passion is an expression of the ego, and victory is pure desire. The Jedi are slaves to a doctrine, while the Sith are slave masters that encourage narcissism and psychopathic and sociopathic tendencies. The Sith are ultimately slaves as well, but to their own desires. The Jedi should have been teaching its students how to restrain and yet strengthen the ego instead of unnaturally suppressing it by discouraging all connections and completely separating children from their birth parents. Fear, anger, and even hate have their purpose when understood in the proper context. This is why I disagree with the conclusion that balancing good and evil is somehow nihilistic or satanic. Balancing good and evil doesn't mean you can go around doing deceitful, destructive, and manipulative things to other people and then turn around and do nice things to balance it off. Balancing good and evil is more about integrating the ego properly. In other words, both extremes of the ego's weakness and its inflation must hinder the reaching of the real self. Your problems and conflicts always result from either too big an ego or too small an ego. When you are both the slave and the slave master, you have balanced the ego in the sense that the only person you own is yourself, and nobody claims ownership over you. Integrating the ego properly is something that is very difficult to do because everything is so dysfunctional in the Star Wars universe. Jung specifies that the less the shadow is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Jung takes the stance that the shadow must be incorporated into the psyche or else it will grow like an infection that allows darkness to fester. With this knowledge, one must ask whether or not the Jedi are actually a good organization. Are they simply enabling the Sith? Are they just two sides of the same coin? The character Yoda is especially questionable. Yoda, being a wise old man, must have known about Anakin and Padme's relationship, and yet he tells him to train himself to let go of everything he fears to lose. Anakin was known to be immature, plus the way that the Jedi are structured, he was recruited too old. He had already built a connection to his mother, and eventually lost her at the hands of raiders. The Jedi had plenty of resources in order to protect her, and yet this was not part of the Jedi code. Instead, they let her die on Tatooine. This was an extremely traumatizing experience for Anakin that he did not want to relive. He killed the entire camp in a fit of anger, passion, and rage. Also, he was born into a broken family where his father was unknown. He had always longed for a father figure, and he believed that the Jedi could provide that masculine role, but the Jedi had failed him, which drove him into the arms of Darth Sidious. Yoda must have known that this was going to happen if he was such a wise old man, and yet he did nothing to stop this. It seems as though Yoda had driven him into the arms of Darth Sidious intentionally. This happens again with Anakin's son, Luke Skywalker, when he trains him but eventually leaves to confront Darth Vader in The Empire Strikes Back. Luke was also trained at an age that was considered to be too old. Luke, being around the same age as Anakin, was also somewhat immature by not completing the training and had many connections to his friends. He also lost his Uncle Owen, who raised him. He could have very easily taken Darth Vader's invitation to join him on the dark side. In Return of the Jedi, he is told to confront Vader again, only this time Darth Sidious was also present. Darth Sidious was known to break the rule of two by taking on apprentices that he knew were going to be put into situations where they would be killed, such as Darth Maul and Count Dooku.
Good, Anakin, good. Kill him.
When Luke defeats his father, Darth Vader, Sidious wants Luke to kill him. This was because he wanted to take Luke on as his true apprentice. It was a gamble that didn't pay off, but you have to wonder if Yoda had intentionally set all of this up for that moment. In both fights with Luke and Darth Vader, there is a window in the background that looks like a spider's web, which is symbolic of a trap. In the first fight with Vader, Luke even falls into the window, showing that he was caught in the trap. In the prequel trilogy, there is a discovery of a clone army on a planet called Kamino. The army was commissioned by a Jedi Council member known as Sifo Dyas. Dyas was having premonitions of a dark time mounting in the near future and became convinced that something must be done to stop this threat. His warnings were ignored by the Jedi High Council, which led him to secretly commission the clone army on the planet of Kamino as a result. After this army was discovered, the Jedi had decided to take on this army to fight for them. It was later discovered that the clone army was taken over by Count Dooku, who was a former Jedi turned Sith who had ordered Dyas to be killed. Instead of investigating the true nature of the clones, Yoda ordered these revelations to be kept secret.
Cover up this discovery. We must. No one, not even the Chancellor, may know.
The clones were outfitted with chips known as Order 66, which wiped out all of the Jedi outside of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda after the Clone Wars. This obviously raises questions over whether or not Yoda was aware of this outcome, considering that he was having premonitions in a cave on Dagobah of this very thing happening. Order 66 can serve as a metaphor for how easily the Jedi, such as Anakin Skywalker, were turned to the dark side. The anger and contempt that Anakin had toward the Jedi Order due to their ineffective teachings and corruption was like a switch that when activated became extremely destructive. Once his confidence in the Jedi was destroyed, he felt there was no other option but to join the Sith and quickly fell for the deceptions of the dark side. He took orders directly from Darth Sidious because he was never truly free. He relied on guidance from an outside source, and Sidious was there to provide that guidance. In conclusion, Star Wars presents us with a dysfunctional universe where young men especially have a difficult time coming to their true selves. Instead, they are presented with a world that manipulates and takes advantage of them in the quest for power and dominance. The Jedi and Sith can in many ways be classified as dangerous cults that leech off the energies of the strongest and most spiritual types in order to maintain their standing in the universe. The films themselves really don't provide answers to these philosophical dilemmas, but instead seduces the viewer into a binary way of thinking. With that said, I do think there is some knowledge to be gained in terms of what is wrong with the Star Wars universe if one views these films with a critical eye, which is why I have produced this video as well as other videos on the topic of Star Wars, in the hopes that people will understand the deeper meanings buried within these films. I hope people enjoyed this series I did on Star Wars, and I'll see you for my next video.